Welcome. We're going to take a look at culture in the 1920s, specifically in the areas of public education, radio, sports, movies, and music and literature. And we have a lot to cover, so let's get right into it with the public schools. So, your book begins in section 3 here of chapter 21 on page 652 by talking about some of the ways in which schools and mass media began to shift our culture. Well, one of the first things that we need to know is that from the 1870s all the way up into the 1920s, Americans saw their population rise by massive numbers of immigration. And there was a powerful movement in our country that greatly influenced business as well as culture and government and society as a whole. So one of the reasons why public schools were reshaped during the 1920s was to help more students become better citizens. And this is definitely true of those who had immigrant families. So in 1914, only 1 million American students attended high school. Many, did not go past the primary grades themselves and often found work before that. But by 1926, the number rose to 4 million. So we see here that, the schools were offering more college-bound courses and vocational education, okay, especially for those in industrial jobs. So, World War I definitely had an impact on that, but in the 1920s, we can see here that the number of students in millions continues to rise all the way up into the 1940s. It should be said, too, that even during this time, not all students attended public school. The taxes used to fund public schools increased as well, and that had an impact on the people themselves. So, public schools also had a huge impact on the changes going on in New Bedford in the 1920s. And one of the things that I wanted to share with you here, this is a little timeline of New Bedford history 1920 to 1929, which we'll go back to in a little bit, saw in 1924, let's see, 1927. The reorganization of the public school system happened in New Bedford as well, and 2 new schools were built. Of course, the high school was located downtown where the administration building is right now. However, 2 new high schools, or junior high schools, were built, one in the north end and one in the south end. Of course, those would later become known as Normandin and Roosevelt Junior High School, also created in the 1920s. So we see this trend in education continuing in New Bedford as well. So the second topic that we're going to take a look at today is radio. Radio had an enormous impact on culture. Of course, there was no TV at this time, and so most Americans began to get access to news and information and variety shows and comedy shows and dramas through the radio. In fact, I think I have here playing some 1920s radio that we can take a listen to briefly. Okay, I think you get the idea. This was from a performer named Ziggy Elman, and this was dance music. Dance music that was very popular, especially with youth. And other forms of popular music we're going to get to later when we take a look at jazz. But this kind of music is available on this website. It's called the 1920s Radio Network, and you can actually click to listen to music as it's being played right now. And they have music from the 20s, 30s, and 40s playing almost all the time. So if you like it, come take a look and you can learn more about the culture there. Radio in the 1920s was a huge factor. If you look here, by 1923, roughly 3 million Americans owned radios. Your book also highlights this fact by taking a look at how many radios were coming into existence during this time. If we can take a look here on your book at page 653, we see that a lot of American households, by 1930, 40% of American households had radios. And I believe the number is listed up above as over 5 million approximately 50 million Americans sat listening to radios by 1927, which is a huge increase. And some examples of that are popular radio dramas like The Lone Ranger, Tarzan, and some popular novels that were read in the 1920s as well. But radio had a huge impact. It influenced the way in which Americans began to see a common culture form, specifically by the mass media. The reason why that's important is because of some of those changes going on in the culture due to immigration. So we see here a picture of Babe Ruth, which brings us to our next topic, which is sports. We're going to focus a little bit here on the Babe and his influence on baseball, which was one of the most popular American pastimes during the 1920s. It should be noted that football and basketball also had their beginnings roughly around this period. But more so than any other character, Babe Ruth kind of symbolizes some of the changes going on in how Americans view sports, because he becomes the very first American sports icon. You know, he drinks, he gambles, he, has late nights out, often with different women, and, becomes kind of a person that is gregarious. His stories, his lifetime, fill the American imagination with all kinds of great adventures. And he was an incredible baseball player. And had many different career highlights, although it should be noted that during this time there were over 200 baseball teams in the Negro Baseball League, which wasn't at that point funded enough to be the official baseball league, but was practiced in a subculture of African American communities around the United States and in literally many urban areas as well. So if you go to negroleaguebaseball.com, you can actually take a look here at some of the frequently asked questions about the Negro League itself. Of course, we all know that Jackie Robinson became famous for breaking the color barrier, but there's a lot more to the Negro League than just that one character. In fact, it begins before the 1890s and continues through the early 20th century. In fact, there were many African American baseball players that actually exceeded Babe Ruth's records, and we'll take a look at that in a little bit. One of the most famous ones was a man named Josh Gibson. His accomplishments are also highlighted. Now on to the silent films. Now, the silent movies were a characteristic of some of the early motion picture cameras, which could not incorporate sound into the moving images. So when the first movies came out, they had no sound except for what an orchestra would play in the background. One of the earliest and most famous of the early generation movie actors and actresses was this man right here. Now we're going to take a look at him in a little bit larger here. His name is Charlie Chaplin, and he is the person who is a comedian, but also has a kind of like a Hitler-like mustache. Although it should be noted that Charlie Chaplin had the mustache first, long before Hitler was around. So in order to actually give you an idea of Charlie Chaplin, I wanted to share with you first some facts about him from a great website. It's called openculture.com. It's a great blog. And here, just a few days ago, they published 15 free Charlie Chaplin films, which you can watch to your heart's delight. Charlie Chaplin starred in over 80 films total, and most during the silent film era. In 1914 alone, he acted in over 40 films, and then another 15 in 1915. He was one of the most famous people in the world at that point. He was actually an Englishman, came to America, and revolutionized the idea of film and cinematography. He starred in, acted, directed, and wrote most of his films himself. And he passed away on Christmas Day in 1977. So if you go to this website, you can see a list of some of his most famous films that you can click on and watch for free. And as you can see, many of them were made in the 1920s. Now, one of the most popular scenes of Charlie Chaplin actually comes from this skit that he did in a movie called The Gold Rush, and some of you might be familiar with it, but I'll just give you an idea here of some of his comedic style. Okay. Charlie Chaplin also became famous during the 1930s and 1940s in a movie that he directed and wrote called The Great Dictator. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. In the end of the movie, it's a silent film, he gives his first talkie, his first on-air voice recording, and he gives a speech, which is a very, very powerful one. I'll play that for you in a little bit later. So Charlie Chaplin, along with others, became the center of the silent film industry. There were films that were made during the 1920s about relationships, again, comedies. There were tragedies, there were stories about America's past. And when we go over the 1910s, we're going to take a look at a movie called Birth of a Nation, which actually has a great deal of racist plot behind it, and we'll focus on that in a little bit more detail. Music and literature. The last two important parts of the 1920s themselves were very difficult to forget. So one of the most common forms of music during this period is jazz. Jazz is something that is often called the both the purest expression of American democracy, as this website acclaims, and also one of the only true American art forms. If you go through this site, you can actually click and listen on to different styles of jazz so that you can get the feel from it. I was also going to play for you some music here by Miles Davis, one of the most famous jazz recording artists, and John Coltrane. Why don't we start with just a touch of Coltrane's incredible saxophone. Now, John Coltrane and Miles Davis both became famous in the 1940s, but jazz had its roots long before that, coming from slave gospel music up through the inner cities and into America's homes. We'll talk more about this and other topics a little bit later.